For more than a century, the portrait existed without urgency. It hung on pale museum walls and in private collections before that, framed in wood polished by time, its surface carefully cleaned, its colors preserved. People noticed it, of course, they always did. A young boy, no older than 8 or 9, seated upright, his shoulders relaxed, his lips curved into a small, confident smile. His eyes met the viewer directly, not with fear or pleading, but with an ease that felt almost modern. Visitors lingered just long enough to register that the painting was pleasant, well composed, even comforting, and then they moved on. There was nothing in it that demanded explanation. It was catalogued simply as a portrait of a boy, mid-19th century. No dramatic plaque, no warnings, no context, just a face frozen in time. The boy's clothing suggested care. A neatly pressed shirt, a modest jacket, buttons fastened properly, hair combed and parted with intention. Whoever painted him had taken time, real time, to capture the softness of his cheeks, the warmth in his eyes, the slight tilt of his head that made him appear approachable, almost playful. This was not a rushed sketch or a crude likeness. It was the kind of portrait reserved for children who mattered, children whose families wanted them remembered. And so, without ever saying it out loud, everyone assumed the same thing: he must have been loved, protected, born into comfort. Paintings like this, people believed, did not belong to the forgotten. In guidebooks and whispered conversations, speculation stayed shallow. Perhaps he was the son of a landowner, perhaps a merchant's child, maybe even a distant cousin of someone important, painted young before illness or war erased him. The painting never contradicted these assumptions. The boy did not look hungry, he did not look frightened, he did not look like someone who had learned to survive by staying invisible. His SMEL seemed practiced, yes, but not forced. It carried the quiet confidence of a child who expected to be seen. That expectation is what made the portrait so easy to accept. Art historians passed it over again and again. They focused on brush technique, pigment quality, stylistic influence. They discussed the painter's possible training, the regional hallmarks of the era, the way light fell gentle. Why across the boy's face? Papers were written about composition, about posture, about the balance between innocence and formality. No one asked who the boy really was, because the painting appeared to answer that question already. It showed a child who belonged in a century shaped by images of suffering, photographs of chains, drawings of punishment, written accounts of cruelty. This portrait felt like a pause, a relief. Proof, perhaps, that not every story from that era was soaked in darkness. Viewers wanted to believe that. They needed to believe it. And the smiling boy gave them permission. The museum lights reflected softly off the varnish, giving his eyes a faint glimmer, as if he were alive in some quiet way, observing the people who stopped in front of him. Children sometimes smiled. Parents pointed him out, explaining how portraits were made before cameras. Teachers used him as an example of 19th century portraiture, of how children were once dressed and posed. No one lowered their voice. No one felt the need to. The portrait never caused discomfort. And that, perhaps, was its most unsettling quality, because absence can be deceptive. Silence can be intentional. And familiarity can dull curiosity faster than ignorance ever could. There were no signs of struggle in the frame, no scars hinted at beneath fabric, no shadow darkened the corners of the canvas. Even the background, a soft, indistinct interior, revealed nothing specific. It could have been any well-kept room in any respectable home. The painter had chosen neutrality, safety, normalcy, everything about. The image whispered, "There is nothing to see here," and so people believed it. For generations, the portrait survived wars, relocations, ownership changes. It passed from private hands to institutional walls, always carrying the same assumption with it. Each new curator inherited not just the painting, but the quiet agreement surrounding it. This was a harmless artifact, a child's likeness, a decorative piece of history. It was never placed in exhibitions about hardship or injustice. It did not belong there. people thought. It belonged among gentle reminders of the past, among furniture, letters, and family heirlooms. The boy's smile made sure of that. It is easy to trust a smile, especially when it comes from a child. Smiles disarm suspicion. They soften the viewer. They promise safe. Thank you. And in a world that prefers comforting narratives to complicated truths, the smile did its job perfectly. It shielded the painting from scrutiny more effectively than any locked archive ever could. Yet, there was something subtly performative about it, something that would only become obvious much later. The smile was careful, not wide, not careless. It was the kind of smile learned early, practiced often. The kind that appears when a child understands that being agreeable brings approval. But at the time, no one looked long enough to notice that distinction. They saw joy because they expected joy. They saw innocence because they wanted innocence. The label beneath the frame remained vague, unchanged for decades. No name, no birthplace, no family attribution, just dates, approximate and cautious. But museums are filled with unnamed subjects, and anonymity alone is not suspicious. History is full of gaps. This one simply blended in. Visitors walked past the portrait carrying assumptions shaped by their own world. In their minds, slavery looked a certain way, harsh, unmistakable, violent, chains, rags, fear. This boy did not fit that image, and so he was unconsciously excluded far. Omit. The possibility never even entered the room. The painting was allowed to exist outside the moral weight of its era, and the boy remained silent. If paintings could feel relief, this one must have felt it every day it went unquestioned. Because being overlooked can be a form of protection, especially when the truth is unbearable. The portrait did not lie outright. It simply allowed viewers to complete the story themselves, knowing they would choose the version that felt safest. It is strange how easily history can be rewritten by omission, how a missing question can preserve a false piece, how an image can survive untouched not because it tells the truth, but because it does not challenge anyone to ask for it. For over 100 years, no one leaned in close enough to feel uneasy. No one paused long enough to wonder why a boy so carefully painted had left no other trace behind. No one asked why a child from a time obsessed with lineage had no recorded family. The smile solved everything before curiosity could form. And so the portrait waited. It waited through changing academic trends, through evolving moral standards, through generations who believed they understood the past better than those before them. It waited because it could, because it had been placed in the category of things that did not require investigation. The smiling boy became part of the background of history, decorative rather than demanding, visible but not seen. His presence reassured rather than unsettled. His silence was interpreted as peace. But silence, when preserved long enough, does not disappear. It hardens. And one day, inevitably, someone notices that what looks harmless has survived for far too long without explanation. The first moment of doubt did not arrive with drama. It came quietly, almost apologetically, the way uncomfortable truths often do. A historian stood in front of the portrait longer than most people ever had, not because the painting demanded it, but Baker. Something refused to settle in his mind. At first, he could not have said what was wrong. The boy's smile was still gentle, the composition still balanced, the colors still held their warmth. Yet the longer he looked, the more the painting began to feel rehearsed, as if it were performing normalcy rather than embodying it. He leaned closer, studying the clothing. The jacket appeared tailored, but not finely so. The cut mimicked upper-class fashion, yet the stitching lacked the precision one would expect from a wealthy household. The fabric absorbed light differently than silk or fine wool. It was serviceable, durable, the kind of material chosen not for elegance but for longevity. This was not the attire of a child meant to be admired for status. It was the attire of a child meant to look presentable. That distinction mattered. The historian stepped back and examined the posture. The boy sat upright, almost too upright for his age, shoulders squared, hands carefully placed. It was not the relaxed pose of a child indulged by comfort, it was the posture of someone accustomed to instruction, someone who knew how to hold still when told, someone who had learned early that obedi. NCE was noticed, and mistakes were not forgiven easily. Still, these were impressions, not evidence. Art invites interpretation, and interpretation can be misleading. The historian reminded himself of that. He had seen thousands of portraits. He had trained himself not to project modern assumptions onto old canvases, and yet this painting resisted dismissal. It lingered in his thoughts long after. He left the gallery. What unsettled him most was not what was visible, but what was missing. Children of the 19th century, especially those whose families could afford portraits, rarely existed in isolation. There were records, letters, wills, baptismal documents, estate inventories. Names appeared in multiple places, weaving individuals into the broader fabric of history. This boy, however, existed only here. One painting, one face, no echoes. When the historian searched the museum's internal files, the absence became clearer. The acquisition records were thin, tracing ownership of the painting but never identifying its subject. Previous scholars had noted the lack of information, but none had pursued it. The assumption had always been the same. The boy's identity was lost to T.I. Me, and that was unfortunate but not unusual. Except it was unusual. Portraits were expensive. Even modest ones required money, time, and intention. Families did not commission them casually. They did so to assert presence, to claim permanence, to ensure that a face would outlive a body. For a child to be painted and then vanish from every other historical trace was not normal. It suggested an extraordinary loss or deliberate erasure. The historian began to examine the background more carefully. What had once seemed neutral now revealed subtle clues. The interior was not richly decorated, no bookshelves, no family heirlooms, no symbols of education or refinement. Instead, there was space, clean, uncluttered, functional. The light entered from a high angle, as it often did in Planta. Tiorn houses designed to keep interiors cool. The architecture hinted rather than declared, but once seen, it could not be unseen. He compared the painting to others from the same region and period. Patterns emerged, similar walls, similar light, similar restraint. And yet, in those other portraits, names were known, lineages documented. This boy stood alone. Curiosity turned into unease. The historian consulted textile experts who confirmed his suspicion about the clothing. The fabric was common, often used for work garments and everyday wear, not for display. It had been cleaned and pressed, perhaps even borrowed, but it was not a child's best outfit. It was a costume of respectability. That realization shifted the entire painting. What once felt natural now felt constructed. Then here was the smile. Smiles in portraiture are rare, especially among children of that era. Many portraits show solemn faces, restrained expressions, a seriousness imposed by long sitting times and cultural expectations. When smiles do appear, they tend to be either exuberant or stiff. This one was neither. It was controlled, polite, almost careful. The historian found himself wondering who the il was for, certainly not for the boy. He imagined the scene, the child seated on a chair too large for him, feet barely touching the floor, instructed to sit still, to look forward, to smile softly. Perhaps someone stood nearby, just out of frame, watching closely. Perhaps the painter glanced repeatedly toward that unseen figure, adjusting his brush based on silent approval. The painting began to feel less like a celebration and more like a negotiation. As questions multiplied, the historian turned to regional archives, census records, tax documents, church registries. He searched for families known to have commissioned portraits in that style, in that area, during that approximate decade. Names surfaced: wealthy landowners, merchants, planters. Their children were documented, extensive. Births recorded, inheritances tracked, marriages announced. But no boy matched the face in the painting. The absence grew louder. Then he noticed something small, almost invisible to the casual eye. On the lower edge of the canvas, near where the frame met the painting, there was a faint marking. Not a signature, not damage, a number, barely perceptible, likely added later, perhaps during an inventory or transfer. It was not an artist's mark, it was administrative. Numbers belong to systems, not families. The historian felt a tightening in his chest as the implications took shape. He had seen similar markings before, though never on a child's portrait. They appeared in ledgers, on crates, on objects catalogued for ownership rather than memory. The idea felt absurd at first. Surely no. One would reduce a child to such a system and then immortalize him in paint. And yet history had done far worse. He revisited the painting once more, this time with different eyes. The boy's hair was neatly cut, but not styled with care. It was practical, short enough not to get in the way. His hands were clean, but the nails were trimmed unevenly, as if cut quickly rather than tended lovingly. Tiny details, easily dismissed, now assembled into a troubling pattern. Nothing about the boy spoke of indulgence. Everything about him spoke of preparation. Preparation for what? The historian did not yet know. But he felt certain now that the painting was not what it pretended to be. It was not a simple family portrait. It was an artifact shaped by power, by secrecy, by something that needed to be hidden in plain sight. The more he investigated, the more resistance he encountered. Not from records, but from assumptions. Colleagues suggested he was overthinking it. The painting had been studied before, they reminded him. If something was wrong, someone would have noticed. But history is full of truths that go unseen, not because they are invisible, but because they are inconvenient. He pressed on. Late at night, surrounded by documents and microfilm, the historian began to notice a pattern in plantation inventories from the region. Children were listed, sometimes by name, often not. Sometimes with notes about appearance, age, health. Occasionally remarks were added: well-mannered, obedient, pleasing disposition, language disturbingly close to what the portrait conveyed. Surely, a chill settled in. The idea that a child could be described, evaluated, and owned like an object was not new. But the idea that such a child could also be painted like a cherished son felt like a cruel contradiction, and yet the contradiction explained everything: the care without recognition, the visibility without identity, the smile without freedom. By the time the historian closed his notebook, the painting no longer felt silent. It felt guarded, like a door sealed not to keep people out, but to keep something in. The portrait had not been ignored because it was unimportant. It had been ignored because it was too easy to misread. It offered comfort where there should have been discomfort. It allowed viewers to see what they wanted to see and move on without consequence. Now the wrongness could not be unseen. The first crack had formed in the story everyone thought they knew, and through that crack, a truth long buried was beginning to breathe. The moment the frame was removed, no one expected history to shift. The conservation room was quiet, procedural, governed by routine rather than anticipation. Gloves were worn, notes were taken. The painting was laid ace down on a padded surface, its canvas exposed like a patient on an operating table. This was standard practice. Frames were often removed to assess damage, to clean accumulated dust, to stabilize aging wood. Nothing about the process suggested revelation. And yet, when the final nail was eased free and the frame lifted away, something loose slid gently onto the table. It was a small piece of yellowed, brittle, folded once, and pressed flat by decades of pressure. It made no sound as it fell, but everyone in the room noticed it at once. Loose papers did not belong there. Paintings sometimes hid secrets, notes from artists, ownership stamps, forgotten letters, but this felt different. The conservator hesitated before touching it, as if afraid the slightest movement might erase what-if. Fragile truth it carried. When the paper was carefully unfolded, its simplicity was striking. No signature, no message, just a number, written in dark ink, accompanied by a few abbreviated marks. It did not resemble an artist's annotation or a collector's note. It looked administrative, functional, cold, the kind of writing meant to identify, not to explain. The historian was called Immediatel. He stared at the paper longer than he had ever stared at the boy's face. The number gnawed at him, stirring an old familiarity he could not yet name. He had seen similar markings before, tucked into ledgers and inventories, stamped on crates and documents that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with control. Numbers used to track assets, numbers meant to prevent loss, not name. The paper was sent for analysis. The ink matched the period, the paper matched the region. Nothing about it suggested forgery or later interference. Whatever it was, it had been placed there intentionally, hidden but not destroyed, preserved by accident or design. And the question now was not why it had survived, but why it had been concealed. The historian returned to the archives with urgency. He brought the number with him like a key, hoping it would fit a lock somewhere in the vast, indifferent machinery of recorded history. At first it did not. Records were incomplete. Pages were missing. Fires, floods, and neglect had claimed much of what once existed. But persistence has a way of wearing down silence. In a regional plantation ledger, its pages stiff with age and stain. Ed by humidity, the number appeared. It sat in a column reserved not for births or deaths, but for property. Alongside it were brief descriptions: age, sex, physical condition, no surnames. Sometimes no names at all, just marks meant to categorize living human beings as units of value. And there, beside the number pulled from behind the portrait, was a simple entry: male child, age approximate, Beau, Morin on estate. The room seemed to shrink. The historian read the line again and again, hoping it would change, hoping he had misunderstood. But the ledger was unambiguous. This was not a coincidence. This was not another boy. This was him. The smiling child from the portrait, reduced in ink to an accounting entry, born not into a family but into ownership. Further entries filled out the outline of a life never meant to be known. The child had no recorded mother, no father, just a notation indicating lineage tied to the estate itself, as if the land had produced him. This was common practice. Enslaved children were often documented this way, their identities absorbed into the property of those who claimed them. Birthdays were approximate, ages were estimated, precision mattered only when it affected labor or value. The historian's hands trembled as he turned the pages. There were notes about health, about demeanor, about potential. Words like compliant and well-behaved appeared in the margins, language disturbingly close to the impression the portrait conveyed. The painting had not invented that calm. It had captured it, and in doing so had aestheticized obedience, the real. Ization settled heavily. The portrait had not been an act of defiance against slavery. It had been a byproduct of it. The historian traced the number through subsequent documents. In one ledger, the boy was listed among household servants. In another, among children assigned to light labor. The records did not say what that labor was, but the implications were clear. He had grown within the bound. Heirs of the estate, his life measured not in years, but in usefulness. And then abruptly, the entries stopped. No record of sale, no record of death, no emancipation notation, just absence. This too was common. Enslaved people disappeared from records all the time, lost, transferred, punished, or killed without documentation. The system did not require completeness. It required control. And once control was no longer necessary, memory became optional. What made this case unbearable was the contradiction. This boy had been documented twice, once as property, once as art. In one context he was counted. In the other he was cherished, or at least presented as such. The two versions of him existed side by side, never meant to intersect. The historian began to understand the purpose of painting. It was not meant to tell the boy's story, it was meant to tell the owner's. Portraits confer legitimacy. They soften reputations. They allow power to masquerade as benevolence. To paint an enslaved child as serene and well cared for was to suggest that the system itself was gentle, even kind. It was visual propaganda, whether consciously intended or not. The boy's smile became avid, hence not of his happiness, but of his submission. And yet there was something else, something more personal. As the historian compared the boy's features to known portraits of the plantation owner, an uncomfortable resemblance emerged. The shape of the eyes, the line of the mouth, the tilt of the head, not exact but close enough to raise questions no ledger would ever answer. Questions about power, rentage, about exploitation layered upon exploitation, about intimacy twisted by power. If the boy was indeed the owner's biological child, the painting took on a new meaning. It was no longer merely decorative, it was confessional, a way to preserve a connection that could not be acknowledged publicly, a way to see the child without naming him, to love without freeing, to remember without responsibility. The paper hidden behind the frame now felt less like an accident and more like a compromise, a trace left behind for someone someday to find, or perhaps simply forgotten, its significance dulled by time. Either way, it had survived long enough to break the spell of the portrait's silence. When the museum reviewed the findings, the room was heavy with discomfort. This was not the kin. Of Discovery institutions celebrated. It complicated narratives. It demanded recontextualization. It forced a confrontation with the ways art had been used to sanitize injustice. Some argued for caution, for further review, for restraint in interpretation, but the evidence did not bend. The number matched, the records aligned. The smiling boy had been born enslaved. In that moment, the painting changed forever. The colors seemed harsher, the smile tighter, the calm expression no longer reassuring but haunting. What once appeared gentle now felt like an accusation. The boy had been telling the truth all along, but no one had known how to listen. The historian returned to the gallery alone one evening, standing before the portrait with the knowledge now etched into his mind. He imagined the boy's life unfolding beyond the frame, days shaped by commands, by labor, by silence. He imagined the moment the portrait was completed, the boy dismissed, returned to a world where his image mattered more than his freedom. The painting had preserved his face, but not his voice. It had saved his likeness, but not his name. And yet, through the smallest surviving detail, a forgotten slip of paper, a number written without care, history had been forced to remember what it tried so hard to erase. The discovery beneath the frame did not restore the boy's life. It did not undo the system that had claimed him, but it shattered the illusion that had protected the portrait for generations. It turned an object of passive beauty into a document of active harm, and once seen that way, it could never return to silence again. Once the truth of the boy's birth emerged, the question that refused to rest was not how he had been enslaved, but why he had been painted. In the brutal economy of slavery, portraits were not made for everyone. They were luxuries, deliberate acts of preservation reserved for those deemed worthy of remembrance. Enslaved people were recorded in ink, not oil. They were counted, traded, inherited, but almost never immortalized, and certainly not with care, certainly not with dignity. The existence of this portrait shattered that rule, and in doing so, exposed something far more unsettling than cruelty alone. Historians searched for parallels and found almost none. There were rare sketches of enslaved individuals, often ethnographic, often dehumanizing, created to catalog types, rather than individuals. But this was different. This painting did not reduce the boy, it elevated him. The artist had softened his features, warmed his complexion, refined his posture. He had been rendered not as labor, but as presence, as someone meant to be seen. That choice demanded an explanation. The first theory was sentimental guilt. Perhaps the owner felt pity, perhaps the child had been favored, spared the harshest treatments, allowed a moment of grace in a world that offered none. This idea was tempting. It offered moral relief. It allowed viewers to imagine humanity surviving even within an inhuman system. but the records refused to support it. There was no indication of manumission, no legal protection, no effort to alter the boy's fate. Whatever affection may have existed, it had not translated into freedom, which meant the painting was not an act of mercy. The second theory was reputation. In the 19th century, portraits were statements. They communicated status, refinement, control. To display a well-dressed, calm child, especially one known privately to be enslaved, was to suggest benevolence. It implied order. It reassured visitors that the household was saint-able, that those within it were well managed. The painting could be read as visual propaganda, a quiet argument that slavery, at least here, was gentle. But even that explanation felt incomplete. Plantation owners had many ways to perform kindness without immortalizing a child who did not legally belong to their family. This portrait had been too carefully executed, too intimate in its framing, to serve only a public purpose. The answer began to take shape in the boy's face. Once the resemblance was noticed, it could not be ignored. The curve of the brow, the spacing of the eyes, the unmistakable echo of another man's features, ones preserved in portraits hanging elsewhere, labeled, named, honored. The plantation owner's likeness existed in multiple forms, his legacy secure. And now, placed beside it in the mind's eye, was the boy. The implication was devastating. Sexual exploitation was woven into the fabric of slavery, though rarely acknowledged in polite records. Enslaved women had no legal right to refuse. Children born from these violations inherited their mother's status, not their father's power. They became living evidence of a crime that could never be prosecuted. Most were hidden in plain sight, their origins unspoken, their existence tolerated but denied. This portrait suggested that denial had limits, if the boy was. The owner's biological child, the painting was not merely decorative. It was a compromise between recognition and erasure. The owner could not claim him publicly without scandal. He could not free him without inviting questions. But he could see him. He could preserve his image. He could acknowledge him privately, in paint, while continuing to benefit from the system that made such contradictions possible. The painting became a way to look without confessing. Art allowed what law forbade. On canvas, the boy could be elevated without being legitimized. He could be cherished without being protected. The portrait held space for emotions that society would not allow to exist openly. Attachment without responsibility, pride without accountability, love without justice. This understanding dark in every detail of the painting. The care taken with the boy's appearance now felt less like kindness and more like possession. The neat clothing was not a gift, it was a presentation. The calm posture was not comfort, it was training. The smile was not joy, it was compliance refined into something palatable. Even the act of commissioning the portrait took on a disturbing intimacy. The owner had chosen to freeze the boy at a certain age, a certain moment, before labor hardened him, before adulthood complicated him, before resemblance became undeniable. The painting preserved the child at a point where affection could exist without challenge. It was a way to stop time. Historians began to read the painting as a mirror rather than a window. It reflected the inner conflict of a man who could not reconcile his actions with his emotions, a man who could acknowledge his child only by denying him a future. The canvas became a confession without words, a record of hypocrisy rendered beautiful enough to survive. And then there was the artist. Painters did not work in ignorance. They saw households from the inside. They observed dynamics visitors never witnessed. The artist would have known who the boy was. He would have understood the unspoken rules governing that home. His brushstrokes, once admired for their gentleness, now appeared complicit. He had helped transform a moral wound into an aesthetic object. Whether he questioned it or not, the result was the same. The painting normalized the abnormal. It made an enslaved child's existence seem safe, even privileged, while concealing the violence that defined his reality. It allowed viewers, then and now, to consume the image without confronting the cost of its creation. That, perhaps, was its most dangerous power. As scholars debated these interpretations, discomfort spread. The painting could no longer be discussed in purely artistic terms. Every attempt to admire it felt like participation in the lie it had been designed to tell. And yet, to reject it entirely felt like erasing the boy once again. This tension mirrored the original injustice. The portrait existed because of exploitation, but it also preserved the only trace of the boy as an individual. Without it, he would have remained a number in a ledger, faceless and forgotten. With it, he survived, trapped inside a story that was never his to control. The question then was not whether the painting should exist, but how it should be understood. Why was a slave child painted like this? Because the system allowed it, because power could afford contradictions, because those who benefited from injustice often sought emotional absolution without structural change, because art can be used to soothe conscience rather than awaken it. The painting was not an anomaly, it was a symptom. It revealed how slavery did not merely destroy lives, it reshaped morality. It taught people how to live with themselves while doing the unthinkable. It allowed affection to coexist with cruelty, beauty with brutality, tenderness with ownership. And the boy, silent within the frame, bore all of it. He had been turned into proof that love and slavery could are the same space. Proof that violence did not always look violent. Proof that injustice could wear a gentle face and still ruin a life. By the time historians reached this understanding, the portrait no longer felt like a mystery waiting to be solved. It felt like a warning waiting to be heard. Today, when people stand before the portrait, the silence around it feels different. What once felt calm now feels heavy, as if the air itself remembers what the painting tried to conceal. The boy's smile has not changed. Paint does not age the way truth does, but the way it is seen has transformed completely. The expression that once reassured viewers now unsettles them, because it no longer belongs to innocence. It belongs to endurance. The boy looks out from the canvas as he always has, but now his gaze carries weight. It is no longer interpreted as cheerful or polite. It feels knowing, as if he has been watching generations pass, waiting for the moment someone would finally understand what he could never say. His smile has become an accusation, not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to ignore once recognized. It asks a single question that echoes through the room: how did you not see me? Museums thrive on context, and context changes everything. When the updated placard was placed beside the painting, visitors slowed. They leaned in closer. Some read the words twice. Others stepped back, as if distance might soften the impact. Children no longer smiled back at the boy. Parents hesitated before explaining. Teachers paused, recalibrating their lessons in real time. The portrait Noel longer served as decoration. It demanded engagement. What unsettled people most was not simply that the boy had been enslaved. History is full of that knowledge. What disturbed them was how easily his reality had been hidden behind familiarity. The painting had done its job too well. It had made injustice look normal, even gentle, and in doing so, it had revealed something uncomfortable about the viewers themselves. Because the boy had been telling the truth the entire time. He had never pretended to be free. He had never claimed joy. He had simply existed, preserved exactly as the system allowed him to be seen. The lie had not been painted onto the canvas. It had been projected onto it by those who wanted reassurance rather than reckoning. The smile now reads differently. It is not be free. It is careful. The kind of smile learned early, shaped by awareness that survival depends on being agreeable. It is the expression of a child who understands power without being able to challenge it. A child who knows when to be still, when to be pleasant, when to disappear. The smile is not weakness, it is strategy, and that is what makes it devastating. Historians began to describe the portrait as a witness rather than an object. It does not explain, it does not defend, it simply remains. In its stillness, it preserves a truth that words often fail to hold, that slavery was not only chains and violence, but also intimacy without consent, affection without protection, visibility without humanity. The boy embodies all of it in a single, quiet expression. There is no record of his death, no account of his adulthood, no document confirming whether he survived long enough to understand what had been done to him. But in a way, that absence has become part of his testimony. It reflects the fate of millions whose lives were never meant to be remembered, whose stories were considered disposable once their labor was exhausted. The portrait refuses that disposal. It insists that even a system built on erasure cannot fully erase. That something always remains, a face, a trace, a number, a smile. And when those fragments are finally assembled, they speak with a clarity that no ledger ever could. Viewers now report a strange sensation when standing before the painting for too long, a discomfort that cannot be explained by facts alone. It is the feeling of being seen by someone history tried to silence, of realizing that the past is not distant, but present, looking back through layers of varnish and time. The boy's eyes seem to follow movement in the room, though they do not. People shift under his gaze, aware that he endured a world that demanded everything from him and gave nothing back. His existence challenges the idea that suffering must look a certain way to be real. He did not look broken, he did not look desperate. And that is precisely why his story matters, because injustice often hides behind normality. The portrait now occupies a different place in the museum, not physically, but morally. It has become a threshold, a point at which viewers must decide how they engage with history. Do they look briefly and move on, as people once did? Or do they allow the discomfort to linger, to reshape their understanding of the past? There is no neutrality left in the image. Some visitors feel anger, others feel shame. Some feel grief for a child they never knew existed until that moment. A few feel defensive, resistant to the idea that something so beautiful could be connected to something so cruel. But all reactions lead back to the same truth. The painting no longer allows indifference. The boy never received freedom in life. There is no evidence that he was ever legally acknowledged, protected, or allowed to choose his own future. But in death, or perhaps more accurately, in memory, he has claimed something powerful. He has forced a reckoning, not through rebellion, not through escape, but through endurance. His smile has survived empires, wars, and generations of denial. It has outlasted the system that created it, and now, stripped of comforting assumptions, it confronts the very people who once found it harmless. The portrait teaches a difficult lesson, that beauty can be complicit, that art can participate in violence without depicting it, that silence can be as damaging as cruelty when it shields power from accountability. It asks viewers to reconsider how many other smiling faces from history have been misread, misunderstood, or deliberately softened to make injustice easier to digest. In this way, the boy has become more than a subject. He has become a measure of how far society has come and how far it still has to go, a measure of whether we are willing to look past appearances and confront the structures that shape them, a measure of whether remembrance can become responsibility rather than mere reflection. When people finally turn away from the portrait, they do so differently now. There is no casual glance, no easy smile in return. There is instead a quiet awareness that something has shifted, that a boundary has been crossed. The boy remains behind them, unchanged, yet transformed by recognition. He does not ask for pity. He does not ask for redemption. He asks only to be seen as he truly was, not as a symbol of kindness, not as an exception, but as evidence. Evidence of a world that could look directly at a child and still deny him humanity. And in that sense, the portrait has completed its final transformation. It is no longer a relic of the past. It is a mirror held up to an Yon who looks at it, asking whether we are willing to confront uncomfortable truths when they appear gentle, familiar, and smiling.